Hey guys, Peter here to tell you about the latest from Dethroned, the Judas Paradox, out September 6th on Reigning Phoenix Music. This album has 11 tracks, 43 minutes in length, and this is the band's 12th full-length studio album. They are a Dutch blackened death metal band. When it comes to the design of this record, I think the overall experience of this album is not necessarily what the album actually has to offer. What the album actually has to offer are songs that have a lot of uniquenesses in them, even though the same elements are present across each and every single song. The overall experience that the record gives you based on this track listing is one of balance, it's one of linearity. It makes the record feel very dense at times and actually compresses the lines, making for a very narrow path for the listener to follow. It doesn't matter how many times I listen to this record, and it doesn't matter how many times I go through it and I find the individual nature of each and every single song and the characteristics that they put forward. Because when I sit down to listen to the record from beginning to end, that overall sense of balance really comes through, and you almost tend to forget about the uniquenesses that the tracks had within themselves. As far as the sound is concerned, I enjoyed the sound on this record tremendously. I think this is an album that has a lot of melody in it, and it has incredibly rich guitar sound all around. It doesn't matter if the songs are overly melodic, because there are some tracks on this record that have a higher sense of melody to them, or if they are heavy, a little bit more dense, a little bit more dark, a little bit more penetrating. This album, on both sides of the coin, has always great guitar work, great guitar textures, and great guitar execution. It's definitely one of the calling cards of this album, and I find it really interesting the way they infuse that melody into the tracks, allowing to cut through some of the density and heaviness of the sound, making these songs a lot easier to digest, a lot easier to process. The tracks where that doesn't happen as consistently, where the sound becomes a little bit thicker, a little bit heavier, and stays thicker and heavier throughout, perhaps only breaking within the solo sections of the songs, those tracks become a little bit more cumbersome, a little bit harder to process, and definitely harder to digest. Not because of how they're put together, but just because of how they compare with the tracks that are a lot more richer guitar-wise throughout their entire soundscape. The difference between the two becomes easily apparent, and that gives you this sensation of one being a lot more natural to follow, being a lot more organic, even in terms of the atmosphere that it creates, versus the other, where it has a more sense of deepness to it, where it has a lot more depth, and within that depth is filled with heaviness, density of sound, and obviously this overall arching vibe that those songs put together, which is a more darker tone to how they come across. Now, the drums on this album also have a great impact. I enjoy the drum sound tremendously as well, because I felt like the drums were a little bit of the soul of this album. I wouldn't call them the heartbeat per se, because this album is really driven by the overall richness of the guitar sound, but they are definitely the soul on the album. It doesn't matter if you're looking at the more melodic tracks, it doesn't matter if you're looking at the heavier, denser tracks. The drums always feel very powerful, but taking its times and creating the right ebbs and flows where you can really feel the punch and the heaviness and the impact that comes from it, but you can also see when they take a few steps back and allow other elements to take the forefront. Even the bass on this record is really well put together. When you think about the way it's put in the mix, the way it's recorded and executed, it sprinkles itself in, or at least it gives you the sensation that it's sprinkled in throughout the entire album. Some songs you notice it a little bit more, some songs you notice a little bit less, but it's always there, helping to define some of the darker tones, some of the darker atmospheres that this record puts forward. It plays a very important role in becoming the catalyst of that darkness, and then knowing how to be subtle, knowing how to have an impact without necessarily jumping into the forefront. That is kudos to the production on the album that allows you to get the maximum effect out of the bass without allowing it to distort what the overall balanced soundscape of this record is all about. Then once you come into the vocals, I think the vocals are one of the most, if not the most, consistent element throughout the entire album. You're not going to get, one performance here, one performance there. I mean, there are some nuances that the vocals take, but that's more impacted by the lyrical content of the songs than by the sound itself. If you look at a song like the Judas Paradox, it's a song that comes in the first person. So obviously the vocal performance is going to match that in terms of what it offers, in terms of what it gives, and in terms of the atmosphere that it brings to the track. Versus, for example, a song like Kashmir Princess. Different approach, not necessarily a different style, but a different approach that has an emotional impact or organic impact in how the vocals come across. The vocals are always very balanced and very together, like I said, very consistent throughout, but these nuances from track to track, really subtle nuances from track to track, considering the impact of the lyrical content of the songs, definitely allows you to get a little bit more, not just out of the vocals, but out of the stories that are included in these songs. Overall, when I look at this album, I look at an album that has a lot of great quality in it, that has a lot of great elements in it, but I cannot escape the fact that at the end of the listening experience, I really have to exercise my mind. I really have to work hard in order to think of tracks that jump out, that create momentums, that create pockets of memories within this record. You remember them when you're listening to them and when you're listening to the album, but after the fact, once you finish the listening experience, this is one of those records that it becomes really difficult to tell the forest from the trees. The album kind of blends it all in under one single umbrella, and I think this record could have been more impactful if these songs had a little bit more room to breathe within their own, and therefore separating themselves a little bit more from one another, giving the album a little bit more of an individualistic nature and not necessarily this far-reaching umbrella that it currently has. As far as favorite songs are concerned, I want to start off with the Judas Paradox. This is the opening track on the album and hands down my favorite song on this record. I think this is the best song on the album. I think it's the song where you find sound, vocal performance, lyrical content, the story within that lyrical content. Everything merges perfectly. It's not always going to be the case on this record, but on this song, all of these elements are working together in perfect harmony for you to get the most out of everything. First person vocal approach, telling the story, narrating the story from that first person standpoint. A song that has a dark melody sound to it, and that sound becomes not just the atmosphere of the song, but the soundtrack of the song, the soundtrack of the lyrics, the soundtracks of the story that's being narrated once again in the first person. The chorus is very somber, but at the same time very bright, melodic, and melancholic, being very textured in the experiences that it offers, not necessarily in the sound that it carries. It has a little bit more of a heavier, drawn-out verses. This creates a nice separation of the two, and overall, it's a great vocal performance on the most, in my opinion, the most complete song on this record. I wanted more songs like the Judas Paradox because it's such an interesting track, has such great elements, and it comes together perfectly. Next we have The Hangman, a more driven black metal style sounding song with heavy drums, with a cold, very cold, ripping riff in the verses, and then more of a melodic sense in the chorus. This obviously helps the song feel more dynamic. It gives more movement to the song. It's also a track that has an outstanding solo section. This song has the best solo section in the entire album. A solo section that you don't necessarily associate with a melodic black metal album or with a blackened death metal record. I mean, you almost associate this solo more with classic heavy metal or even prog. Very elaborate, very rich, really lasting long, like stretching itself out, but you never feel like it's stretching itself for the sake of stretching itself. It feels like it has a sense of purpose, it has a sense of direction, and it really helps give that same sense of purpose and sense of direction to the entire song and how it all comes together. Last but definitely not least, Kashmir Princess. This track is really interesting. It has this amazing melodic riff sound opening it up, And then once you start to realize that this song is perhaps one of the richest sounding songs guitar-wise in the entire album. It has so many different textures, has so many different layers, it has so many different approaches. The way they put this track together, it's almost a guitar clinic in terms of how you can create not only a black and death metal song, but also a very melodic black and death metal song. So it's a track that still has heaviness throughout in terms of the drums and in terms of the vocal performance, but the richness of the guitar sound is what's going to sell you on how this track is all put together. This is it, God Dethroned with the Judas Paradox, out September 6th on Reigning Phoenix Music. Let me know your thoughts on the band. Hit me up in the comment section. See you all at the next video. Take care, guys.